Welcome to Summerlin Church. I'm Peter By. Bart Tarman will be along in just a moment with the latest in his series on healing and transformation called Self-Righteousness. Kathleen, Sieck, and Hodges will join us with another beautiful song of the season, O Holy Night. And Jenny Slera has another great children's story time for us all today, the King of All Kings. As we anticipate the King of all kings coming into the world, we've been anxiously counting the days by lighting our Advent candles. On the first Sunday of Advent, we lit the first purple candle, the candle of hope. On the second Sunday, another purple candle, this one of peace. On the third Sunday, we lit the rose candle. It's the candle of joy. And today, we light the fourth candle. It's the candle of love. And as we've done so, we hear these words from Isaiah, chapter 7, verse 14 and following. The Lord will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel, which means God with us. And of course, on Christmas Eve, we'll light the center candle, the Christ candle, as we welcome in the light and the love that's coming into the world, the light and the love that the darkness shall never extinguish. And now here's Bart with today's message, Self-Righteousness.
Welcome to Summerlin Church, our fourth Sunday in Advent, right before we celebrate that great day when God's own presence became a little child, and we could see him, and we could then see his whole life, and we could relish it and be healed by it. We're finishing up Advent, and as in the painting that I was challenged to do, actually, of Advent, it's the idea that light forces out darkness, and it's not even a real fight. It comes into the darkness, and the darkness recedes. And so this Advent, we're waiting for the advent of that, which actually is coming toward us all the time. And in the midst of Advent, we're at the tail end of a series on healing and transformation. We've been looking at the life of Jesus, and he did a lot of healing, physical healing. And we've been looking at it to say, what would that mean for us today? How could he heal our sight so that we could see life more clearly? How could he heal our hearing, some of the narratives and the voices that go through our head that are self-destructive? How can we heal those voices and hear the voice of God which builds us and encourages us? How can we heal it when we get stuck or paralyzed? So we've been looking at those. We looked at how do we get healed of rejection and condemnation? How do we cast out the demons within us? How do we have them cast out? And today I'm going to look at a tough one. I'm going to look at self-righteousness. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I've got an aunt who's really self-righteous, And you're thinking of the other political party, whichever one you aren't in, and you're thinking, now those folks are really self-righteous. And I want you for a moment to look at your own life. But this is the problem. So before I retired from pastoral counseling about 5 years ago, I spent 45 years doing pastoral counseling. And I'm here to tell you the toughest person to help is, ironically, the person who doesn't think they need help because they've got it right. It's the person who comes in for marriage counseling and they're sure, and this can be men or women, and they're pretty sure that they've come to this marriage counseling session with the pastor so that the pastor can fix their spouse. Because their spouse is clearly the one in the wrong, because they wouldn't say because I'm self-righteous, of course. They'd just say, I'm right. Or they don't understand me. And they don't see their own need. And it's a delicate operation in counseling to build trust and yet help people pull away the veneer of their own hubris, their own arrogance. It's actually an experience of being oppressed, but the oppressed person doesn't even know they're oppressed. Because they think, in the worst case scenario, they think they're the center of the world. Psychological diagnosis would call it narcissism, where they're so self-righteous that they don't even think they're right. They know they're right, and that the world revolves around them. A Christ consciousness, a Christ-filled person, a person who's taken every thought captive to Christ, or most thoughts, is the exact opposite of that. Exact opposite of a narcissist. It's one who's self-forgetful, not self-centered, not self-focused. They're self-forgetful, and they're wanting to help others. And so in this Advent, we talked these last few weeks that the central message of Advent is that we're finding an experience of having a God who is with us and who is for us. This God is both. And the dawning of the experience of knowing this God through Christ and the Holy Spirit is the dawning of love in our own life. But it takes truth also. So some of you have been wondering, well, Bart, you preach a lot about grace and a lot about forgiveness. What about truth? Well, this is going to be a talk about that, and they're not opposites. Loving truth, just like we looked at loving power pushes out the demons, welcoming love pushes out the rejection and the self-condemnation, while loving truth pushes out self-righteousness. Now, in Jesus' day, there were two groups that were kind of symbolized and epitomized this idea of being self-righteous. But unless you know a little bit about them, you might have the wrong impression. They're called the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they're kind of like if you were in a melodrama, when they come on stage, everybody goes, boo, when you're reading the New Testament. It's got, oh. But actually, these were just ordinary people. And the Pharisees were not religious professionals. They weren't people like me. They weren't ministers or priests or rabbis. They were ordinary business people who had a deep devotion to the Scriptures and who had a deep devotion to keeping the law as they saw it. And when I say law, I don't mean the law of the country. I mean the law of the Scriptures, the moral law, which then became also ceremonial law. And so they would keep it. They would, for example, Jesus mentioned you even tithe your herbs, your mint and your cumin and your dill. I mean, you literally take 10% to give to the poor of a little piece of dill, but you forget to do justice and mercy. You do it in the little things, but you miss the big things. Those are the Pharisees. Now think about it today. These are Bible-believing, you might even say born again, people who go to church, in this case synagogue, who try to live very moral lives, but who become very convinced of their own goodness, very convinced of it. The Sadducees were more like people like me. They were the religious professionals. They were actually more the scholars, the biblical scholars of the day. Now, Jesus had trouble with these two groups of people. And that's not to say everybody in those groups was this way. There are lots of good and sincere people within these groups. And we're going to look at one of them in a second, very famous one. But I want you first to see what Jesus, and by the way, Jesus was truth. So when Jesus walked in the room, truth walked into the room. I want you to see what Jesus' truth looked like in one setting where he was talking to these people. Now you hear me talk about how loving and gracious Jesus was. There are a couple exceptions, at least it seems that way. And here's one. He says this in Matthew 23. He's talking to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. By the way, the Sadducees could also be called teachers of the law. And here's what he says to them. This is his opening comment in this context. He was literally there with them. He's talking to them. And he says, woe to you, you teachers of the law and Pharisees, or you Sadducees and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, and you yourselves do not enter in, nor will you let those enter in who are trying to. Whew. Woe to you is his beginning words. Hypocrites, Oh, but he goes on. Maybe he'll sort of soften it. Woe to you, teachers of the law, you Pharisees, you hypocrites. Sounds like he's maybe not going to soften it too much. You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you've succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are yourself. Whoa! What happened to Jesus meek and mild? What happened to welcoming love? Well, maybe he softens it up a little later. Woe to you, blind guides. Oh, that doesn't seem to. Let's go down a little further. Maybe he'll soften it up. Woe to you, teachers of the law, you hypocrites. You give a tenth of your spices, and you neglect the important matters of the law like justice and mercy and faithfulness. You blind guides. You strain out the gnat, and you swallow the camel. I mean, what a cutting. And then this one these last two kind of cap it off. Actually, there's more. There's 7 of them. Woe to you, teachers of the law, Pharisees, hypocrites. You clean the outside of the cup and dish, and the inside is full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the dish, and then the outside will be clean. In fact, he goes on to call them whitewashed tombs and unmarked graves. Why is Jesus being so tough on these people? Is it because he doesn't love them? I don't believe so. This is a side of love, as George MacDonald said. It's love outside the house. It's like a storm. It batters the windows. It shakes the door. It rattles the rooftop, because it's love on the outside that wants to be in. But you can only let it in from the inside, and so it's shaking you. It's like if you had a child who was moving to put their hand into a burning fire, you wouldn't speak softly. You'd say, stop, don't do that, because they're getting so close to harming themselves. These folks, in Jesus' mind, were, as he said, were closer to the fires of hell. And he did not want them to fall off into that chasm, so to speak, that self-destructive chasm, which we call hell. See, they were full of religious certainty, religious pride, intolerance, and superiority. Sometimes we're that way. The old phrase in the Old Testament was that they were hard of heart. It was one of the worst sins mentioned, that their hearts were hardened. And so he is trying to break through a hardened heart to wake them up and to welcome them in. But not as people who have no need, but people who have a need. You know, there's these 2 instances where Jesus, in John chapter 2, he changes water into wine at a wedding feast. And the way he did it is kind of interesting, because it says they found these ceremonial jars which held, I forgot how much exactly, like 90 gallons of liquid. And they were used for the ceremonial washing, for all these rules and regulations that the Pharisees and the Sadducees followed. And in the Gospel of John, it said the jars were empty. It's a very symbolic statement. They were empty, they were useless. So he said, fill those jars, then dip it in the water, and take it out and serve it to the master of ceremonies. And in that process, Christ had turned water into wine. He'd taken empty things that weren't working, self-righteous things in a sense, and he turned it into new wine that helped a party go on, helped a wedding feast that would last days go on. And the master of ceremonies says, oh my gosh, this is the best wine yet. You usually serve the best wine first, and when people have had a little too much to drink, you bring out the bad stuff. You've saved the best for last. See, that's the gospel. It's the newness. It's the freshness. It's not empty. It's full. After that, he goes to the temple, and he kicks a bunch of people out of the temple. Because why? They had been extorting folks at the temple, where they're supposed to be leading people into a deeper relationship with a loving God. You see, this side of truth is hard-hitting. It's what we experience sometimes in a good marriage. when your spouse hits you with something that's really true about yourself, but you don't want to hear it. C.S. Lewis said, if you're in a good marriage like he was to his wife Joy before she passed away, their very short marriage, he said it's like bumping into a solid oak table in the dark of night when you come up against the criticism of your wife toward yourself, or it could work the other way around. But it's solid and it's real. See, that sometimes truth is solid, real, and when you bump up against it, it hurts, because it strips you of some of your illusions and some of your delusions of certainty. And then lastly, he meets this man named Nicodemus, from whom we get this phrase, born again. Nicodemus was one of these people. Nicodemus came to him. He was a Pharisee. He came to Jesus at night. He seemed to be very sincere. He calls him good teacher. He's asking, what must I do? And Jesus says, look, you've got to be born again. Now, I want to mention something here. He only said be born again to one person. It's kind of interesting. In 20th century and 21st century Christianity, at least in North America, we want everybody to be born again. We go and tell everybody. He told one person this because it was a very meaningful concept to that one person. That something new has to happen in your life, Nicodemus. Right now, it's like an empty vessel of the old, and it needs new wine. And it's like a new birth. It's like a whole fresh start. Well, we later know that Nicodemus was deeply changed by this conversation. In fact, when Jesus died on the cross, it was Nicodemus and another one of his friends, Joseph of Arimathea, who found a place to put Jesus' body, and that was dangerous for them to do. So clearly this message broke through what could have been a hard heart and opened the aperture so that light could come in, and he could be healed of this oppressive paradigm of self-righteousness, this false view that I don't have any needs, that my team has it right and your team doesn't, that my doctrines are perfect and yours are still flawed. I want to read you a story about what loving truth looks like. And it's from a book called Wild Mercy by Mirabai Starr. And she's talking here about a topic that you might not think would relate. She's talking about a concept called restorative justice. But it's also a story about how loving truth can transform. Settle back and listen to it. It'll be about a 3-minute read. It's very powerful. One of the most powerful experiences I ever had in a lifetime overflowing with powerful experiences was sitting in a restorative justice circle. I was there in the capacity of a grief counselor to a woman whose 16-year-old daughter had been run over by her boyfriend following a fight. They were in the parking lot of a motel where they'd been partying. When the young man entered the room where we were, and the session started to take place, his hands were cuffed, his feet were shackled. He did not make eye contact with anyone gathered there, including his own parents. And even after he was seated, he did not look up. Now each person spoke of the ways that they were impacted by the event. And at first, his face was like stone. But little by little, I saw his body language begin to register what was happening around him. As the girls' basketball buddies spoke and cried, he flinched. His girlfriend's sister, who was pregnant, wept when she expressed that her dead sister would never get to be an auntie or a mom herself. Her stepfather spoke of his helplessness in the face of his wife's grief. But when the mother spoke, she didn't cry. She did not hurl hateful accusations. She quietly shared the texture of her days, her sleepless nights, her tortured dreams, waking up to remember all over again that her beautiful, feisty daughter was gone. And then, to the amazement of everyone present, she shifted her focus from her own pain to her daughter's boyfriend. She acknowledged that not only had she lost a child, but that he had lost his girlfriend. She told him that she holds him in prayer and that she might like to even visit him in prison to see how he's doing. She hoped this tragedy would inspire him to return to his community and teach boys about nonviolence. And this mighty mama shared her heart. I watched as she shared her heart. I watched the young man's eyes fill with tears. Soon, it's going to be hard to read, soon he was openly weeping. And then we were all crying. Her family, his family, the district attorney, and me. When it was my turn to speak, I encouraged the young man to use his prison sentence as a monastic opportunity to pray and meditate, and I gave him some books to start his journey. After everyone had had a chance to share how this incident had affected them, a blanket of collective exhaustion, laced with tranquility, fell over our group and rendered us momentarily mute. The facilitator skillfully allowed us to sit in this sacred hush for a few minutes before closing the circle. And then the girl's mom asked if she could hug her daughter's boyfriend. And the guards consented. As if in the presence of the Madonna herself, we all made way for her as she crossed the room to where stood the person responsible for her child's death, who was suddenly looking very much like a little boy. She took him into her arms and began whispering in his ear while stroking his head, his shaved head. His shoulders were trembling and heaving. They stayed that way, pressed together, for a long time. And then he was led away, back to jail. His sentencing followed later that week, taking into account the transformational fruits of our restorative justice process. The fabric of community had been carefully and collectively rewoven. Not a single one of us would ever be the same. That's a story of loving truth. They told the truth to the boy, but they told him in love. And then when words ran out, the mother expressed that love physically. That's the power that can break through a hardened heart. And wherever yours may be hardened, or mine may be hardened, I pray that we will open up that aperture and let the light of that loving truth soften us so that, like that boy, we're trembling in the arms of Christ as he whispers in our ear, I am with you and I am for you.
O holy night, the stars are brightly shining. It is the night of the dear Savior's birth. Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. A thrill of hope, the weary world rejoices, for yonder breaks joyous morn, fall on your knees. Oh, hear the angel voices, oh, night divine, oh, night when Christ was born. Oh, night divine, oh, night when Christ was born.
Truly, He taught us to love one another. His law is love, and His gospel is peace. Chains shall He break, for the slave is our brother, and in His name all oppression shall cease. Sweet hymns of joy in grateful chorus raise, we let all within us praise His holy name. Christ is the Lord. Oh, praise His name forever. His power and glory evermore
proclaim His power and glory evermore
Thanks, Kathleen and Rob. We just love your music. It's such a wonderful uplift for all of us. I wanted to give you all a very joyful update on our matching funds. As you'll remember, we felt that we might be $60,000 short at the end of the year, and we had some very generous people donate $30,000 of matching money if we could match it, which would give us the 60, which would put us in the black. And as of today, we have all but $3,400 of that match. So we've taken in over $26,000 in matching funds, large and small, from lots of different people, and we are just so grateful. So it's a very small gap, and we've also had some other generous donations to the just general fund, which is our general operating fund. So we really appreciate it. We're so thankful, and we're excited to see this amazing and concerning year end for our little church, at least with a balanced budget. So thanks for your generosity.